"Take him alive," the man whispered, so softly it never reached the table. But the glass in her hand felt it. Elena Vance didn't look up. Not immediately. Her fingers steady around the stem of a half-filled Cabernet. Her posture relaxed, almost invisible against the warm amber glow of the dining room. Yet something had shifted, something microscopic, like a note slightly off in a perfect symphony. The restaurant breathed in low tones, silverware against porcelain, muted laughter, the distant hum of Manhattan traffic bleeding through rain-streaked windows. And in the center of it all sat Jonathan Hale, a man whose decisions moved markets, whose name carried weight in rooms most people would never see, seated alone at a corner table designed for two, the empty chair across from him untouched, as if it belonged to someone who no longer arrived. Elena moved through the room without sound, her steps measured, efficient, a quiet rhythm that blended into the background, refilling water before it was requested, clearing plates before they became clutter, her presence registered only when necessary and forgotten just as quickly, exactly how she preferred it. She placed the wine gently beside Hale's right hand, the glass landing without a single ripple, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, her eyes lifted, not to him, but beyond him, tracking a reflection in the polished steel of a serving tray across the room. Two men had entered within 10 seconds of each other, both well dressed, both unremarkable at first glance, but their timing was too clean, their movements too deliberate, their attention not on the menu, not on the room, but on alignment, spacing, exits. Elena turned away before anyone could notice the shift in her gaze, her expression unchanged, but her breathing slowed, controlled, as if syncing with something deeper than the moment. She passed the bar, catching another detail. The third man, seated but not seated, weight forward, scanning without turning. His head, a habit that didn't belong in places like this. Outside, rain traced thin lines down the glass, distorting the city lights into soft streaks. But inside, everything sharpened for her, every angle, every distance measured in instinct rather than thought. Jonathan Hale reached for his glass without looking up, his attention fixed somewhere distant, somewhere internal, unaware that the room around him had begun to rearrange itself in quiet, precise ways. Elena adjusted a fork at a nearby table, her fingers brushing the cool metal, her eyes never lingering in one place too long, and then she saw it. The fourth position near the kitchen corridor, the fifth near the entrance, not obvious, not coordinated in any way a normal observer would catch, but to her it formed something unmistakable, a pattern she hadn't seen in years, but had never truly forgotten. She paused for less than a heartbeat, just long enough for the memory to surface, not as a thought, but as a sensation, a recognition embedded deeper than language. The locket at her collar rested cold against her skin, a silent anchor, and for the first time that evening, her hand stilled completely. She could walk away, continue the shift, let the night unfold without her, because technically none of this belonged to her world anymore. But then Hale shifted slightly in his chair, a subtle movement, almost nothing, and in the reflection of his untouched glass, Elena saw the line converge. Her fingers released. The fork perfectly aligned, and she exhaled slowly, not louder, not deeper, just enough. Somewhere in the room, a chair moved half an inch too early. And that was when she knew the pattern had already begun. The mistake was not loud. It was almost polite, a half step taken a second too soon, a glance held half a second too long, and in a room like this, that was enough. Elena moved again, smooth and unhurried, lifting a tray from the service station as if nothing had changed, but her path shifted by inches, recalculated, deliberate. She passed behind the bar and caught another reflection. The man near the entrance adjusted his sleeve, not to fix it, but to signal, subtle, efficient, invisible too. Anyone who did not know what to look for. And that was when the room divided itself in her mind into lines and angles, into entry points and exits, in a time measured not in minutes, but in breaths. Jonathan Hale remained still, his attention somewhere far beyond the table, his hand resting near the glass, but not lifting it, his posture controlled, composed, the kind of stillness that came from years of command. Yet even that control had limits, and Elena could see where the limits would be. Tested, she had seen it before, not here, not in a place filled with soft music and polished wood, but in spaces where silence meant something else entirely. She stepped closer to his table. Not directly, never directly. Her movement part of the rhythm of service, a quiet arc that brought her within reach without drawing attention. And as she passed, she adjusted the position of his glass by less than an inch. A gesture so small it could be dismissed as routine, but the angle changed, the reflection sharpened, and now he could see what she saw. If he chose to look, he did not react immediately. But there was a pause, a fraction, his eyes lowering just enough to catch the altered line of sight. And in that instant, something in his expression shifted. Not fear, not surprise, but awareness, the kind that did not announce itself. Across the room, one of the men leaned slightly forward, his attention narrowing, his timing disrupted by something he could not name. And that was the first fracture, invisible, but real. Elena continued walking, her pace unchanged, her face neutral, but her mind was already ahead, mapping the next movement before it happened. Because patterns like this did not tolerate hesitation. They relied on precision, on predictability, and the moment that predictability broke, everything else followed. She set the tray down near another table, her fingers releasing it without a sound, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to breathe, not deeper, not faster, just enough to confirm the decision had already been made. The locket at her neck shifted, slightly as she turned, catching a glint of light, and with it came a memory, not in images, but in discipline, in the quiet instruction that had once been repeated until it no longer needed words. You do not wait for the moment. You shape it. Near the kitchen corridor, the fourth position adjusted again, compensating, recalibrating, but now the sequence was off, the spacing imperfect. An imperfection in something designed to be flawless was the beginning of collapse. Jonathan Hale lifted his glass at last, not to drink, but to see, the surface catching the room in a distorted mirror. And in that reflection, he found what he had missed, 5 points that should not have aligned, 5 movements that did not belong. And across from him, the empty chair no longer felt empty. Elena did not look back at him. She did not need to. The shift had already reached him. And now the room held its breath in a way no one could explain. Conversations continued. Silverware still touched porcelain. But beneath it all, something had changed direction, and only 2 people in that room understood it. One who had just realized it, and one who had seen it long before it began. The room did not change, not in any way that could be seen, yet everything inside it had already begun to shift. Jonathan Hale set the glass down without drinking, the faint sound of crystal touching linen absorbed by the quiet hum of the restaurant. But his eyes no longer drifted. They measured, they tracked, they confirmed what the reflection had suggested. 5 positions, 5 intentions, and none of them aligned with chance. Elena Vance moved again, her presence dissolving back into the rhythm of service, but now each step carried weight, each motion placed with intent. She passed behind him once more, close enough to register, far enough to remain unnoticed. And this time she spoke, not to him, not directly, but into the space between action and silence, her voice low, even controlled. "Do not stand up," she said, the words soft enough to be mistaken for breath. And then she was gone, already moving toward the far side of the room. Hale did not turn. He did not acknowledge. But the command settled, precise, and he adjusted nothing except his awareness, his hand resting on the table, his posture unchanged, because any visible reaction would confirm what had not yet been revealed. Near the entrance, one of the men shifted again, a correction layered over a mistake, his attention narrowing toward Hale's table. But something in the sequence was no longer clean, the timing no longer perfect. In an operations built on precision, even a fraction of uncertainty spread, like a fracture through glass. Elena reached the service station and lifted a folded napkin, smoothing it once, twice, her fingers steady, her breathing unchanged, but inside, calculations moved faster than thought. Angles, distances, timing measured in less than a second. She had already seen the pattern, already mapped the outcome, and now she adjusted it. Not by force, but by presence. She stepped into the path of the man, near the corridor, not blocking him, not confronting him, simply existing where he had not accounted for her. And for a moment, just a moment, he hesitated, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to break alignment. Across the room, another man responded to that hesitation, his gaze flickering, recalibrating, and now the 5 points were no longer synchronized. They were reacting instead of leading. Hale's eyes lifted slightly, not toward Elena, but toward the room itself, and he saw it, the subtle unraveling, the way controlled movement had turned into adjustment, the way certainty had been replaced by correction, and he understood then that whatever was happening, it was no longer entirely in their control. Elena continued forward, placing the napkin at an empty table, aligning it with unnecessary precision, a gesture that meant nothing and everything, because in that moment she dictated the pace, she dictated the delay, and delay was the one variable no plan could tolerate. The man near the entrance took a step, then another, but the timing was off, the sequence broken, and now. Every movement required thought, and thought slowed everything down. The room still sounded the same. Glasses touched, voices murmured. The rain traced its quiet path along the windows. But beneath it all, the structure had changed, and only those who were part of it could feel the shift. Elena turned once more, her gaze passing over Hale for the briefest second. Not a look, not a signal, but a confirmation, and then she moved away again, disappearing back into the flow of the restaurant, as if she had never been there at all, leaving behind a room that no longer belonged to the 5 men who had entered it, but to the one person they had failed to see. Control did not return all at once. It shifted gradually, like a current changing direction beneath still water, and by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late to recover. The man near the entrance slowed, not because he chose to, but because something in the room no longer matched his expectation. His eyes moved once across the floor, recalculating, searching for confirmation that never came, while the others adjusted in silence, each waiting for a signal that had already lost its meaning. Elena Vance stepped back into the center of the room, carrying nothing this time. No tray, no glass, just the quiet authority of movement that belonged exactly where it was. She crossed between 2 tables, at a natural pace, her shoulder passing just within the peripheral vision of the second man. And again, he hesitated, not long, not obvious, but enough to break the invisible thread that held their timing together. Jonathan Hale felt it before he fully understood it, the way tension dissolved without release, the way a plan unraveled without confrontation, and he remained exactly as he was, seated, composed, his hand resting near the edge of the table, because now he understood that stillness was not weakness, it was alignment with something he did not yet see. Elena reached the far side of the dining room and paused briefly beside a polished wooden column, her reflection faint in its surface, and in that reflection she watched the pattern collapse, not through force, not through conflict, but through absence, the absence of certainty, the absence of synchronization, the absence of control. One of the men adjusted his stance again, then corrected it, then paused, caught between action and doubt. And in that hesitation, the entire structure lost its foundation, because what had once been a coordinated sequence was now 5 separate decisions trying to reconnect. The rain outside grew slightly heavier, the sound tapping softly against the glass, blending into the rhythm of the room, and for a moment, everything felt ordinary again. Conversations resumed their natural cadence. A server laughed quietly near the bar. A couple at the window leaned closer together, unaware that anything had nearly shifted beneath them. Elena exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in completion. Her work was not finished, but the outcome had already been decided. She stepped away from the column and moved back toward the service station, her path once again blending into the flow of the restaurant, her presence dissolving into the background where it had always belonged. Jonathan Hale finally lifted his glass and took a measured sip, his eyes no longer searching, no longer tracking, because now he understood that whatever had been set in motion had been quietly redirected, and that the person responsible for it had already stepped out of the center of the moment. Near the entrance, the first man turned slightly, his attention shifting away from the table, not in retreat, but in recalculation, and one by one, the others followed, their positions loosening, their formation dissolving into something indistinct, something unremarkable, as if they had never been connected at all. Elena adjusted a single fork at an empty table, aligning it perfectly with the edge, a small, unnecessary detail. And then she stepped back, her eyes calm, her breathing steady, as the room returned to what it had always appeared to be, a place of quiet luxury, of controlled elegance, of unnoticed movement. And in that stillness, the most important change remained invisible, because power had shifted hands without a single raised voice, without a single visible act, and only one person in the room had done it without ever being seen. Silence settled in layers, not empty, but complete, like a system returning to equilibrium after a disturbance too subtle for most to ever notice, and Elena Vance moved through it without hesitation, her hands occupied once more with ordinary things, a water pitcher, a folded cloth, a quiet nod to a table that did not need her yet, because normalcy was not something you waited for. It was something you reinforced. Jonathan Hale placed his glass down again, slower this time, his gaze no longer scanning, no longer calculating, but observing with a different kind of awareness, one that did not search for threats, but for the absence of them, and that absence told him more than any confirmation ever could. Near the entrance, the first man adjusted his jacket, a motion that now meant nothing, because the signal had no structure left to carry, and one by one, the others dissolved into the room, their presence blending back into the background of wealth and conversation, indistinguishable from any other guest, as if the pattern that had once connected them had never existed at all. Elena paused beside the bar, her fingers resting lightly against the polished surface, her reflection faint, her expression unchanged, but inside, the sequence replayed once, not for doubt, not for correction, but for closure. Every step accounted for, every shift understood, nothing left unresolved. A server passed her with a quiet smile. Unaware, a couple laughed softly at a nearby table. Unaware, the city outside continued its endless motion. Unaware, and that was the point, because the most precise actions left no trace when they were done correctly. Hale leaned back slightly in his chair, the empty seat across from him still untouched, but now it no longer felt like absence. It felt like space that had been preserved. Not by chance, but by intervention he had not asked for and had not expected. His eyes moved once, briefly, toward the far side of the room, not searching, but acknowledging, and there she was, already somewhere else, adjusting the angle of a glass, aligning something that did not need alignment, her presence once again reduced to something ordinary, something forgettable, exactly as it had been when he first arrived. He understood then that whatever she had done it without claiming it, without marking it, without leaving behind anything that could be pointed to, and that made it something else entirely, something that did not belong to recognition or reward. Elena lifted the glass, inspected it for a moment that was longer than necessary, then placed it back down with perfect precision, her movements slow, controlled, unremarkable, but beneath that simplicity was a final confirmation. The room was stable, the variables resolved, the outcome sealed. The man who had stood nearest the corridor walked toward the exit without urgency, without signal, just another guest leaving a dinner that had never truly happened, and the others followed in their own time, separated now, disconnected, their presence fading into memory before anyone could question it. Hale reached for his check, not because he was ready to leave, but because the moment had ended, and moments like that did not linger. They closed quietly, without ceremony. Elena stepped away from the table she had just adjusted, her hands empty again, her posture relaxed, her eyes calm. And as she moved past him one final time, she did not slow, she did not speak, she did not look at him, because nothing needed to be said, and in that silence, the truth settled fully into place, that control did not always arrive with force, and power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply moved through a room, corrected what needed to be corrected, and left before anyone realized it had been. There it all. The check arrived in a slim black folder, placed gently at the edge of Jonathan Hale's table, and for a moment he did not reach for it, his hand resting beside it, as if the decision to leave required more than movement, as if it required understanding. Across the room, Elena Vance continued her quiet circuit, her steps light, her presence dissolving into the rhythm of the restaurant once more. But something had changed, not in her posture, not in her expression, but in the air around her, a subtle shift that only someone who had felt it before could recognize. Hale finally opened the folder, his eyes scanning the total without truly seeing it, his attention anchored elsewhere, replaying the sequence in his mind, not the actions, because there had been none he could point to, but the absence of them, the way something had been prevented without ever becoming visible, and that absence unsettled him more than any confrontation would have. He signed his name slowly, deliberately, the pen moving with controlled precision, then closed the folder and stood, not abruptly, not cautiously, just enough to signal that the moment had passed. The chair behind him made a soft sound against the floor, almost respectful, and for the first time that evening, he allowed himself to look directly across the room, not searching, but choosing. Elena was near the service station again, aligning a stack of folded napkins, her fingers moving with the same careful attention she had given to everything else. And when his gaze reached her, she did not react, not immediately, but after a brief pause, less than a second, she lifted her eyes, meeting his without hesitation, without deference, without anything that suggested surprise. It was not a long look, it did not need to be, because in that brief connection, something passed between them that required no words, no acknowledgement, only recognition. Hale stepped away from the table and walked toward the exit, his pace measured, his posture unchanged, but his awareness sharpened in a different way, no longer defensive, no longer reactive, but observant, as if he had just been reminded that control did not always belong to the person who held the most power on paper. As he passed her, Elena shifted slightly to allow space. A natural movement, a professional courtesy, and as he moved by, he spoke, his voice low, steady. "Thank you." The words simple, unadorned, but precise. Elena did not respond immediately, her hands still resting on the napkins, her gaze returning to them for a moment before she answered, her voice just as quiet, just as controlled. "For what, sir?" And there was no challenge in it, no pretense, only the calm neutrality of someone who had already decided that nothing had happened worth explaining. Hale paused for half a second, just enough to consider the question, then gave a slight nod, not in dismissal, but in understanding, because whatever had occurred did not belong to explanation, it belonged to silence. He continued toward the door, the rain outside now a steady curtain against the glass, the city beyond blurred into motion and light, and, as he stepped out, the door closing softly behind him, the world resumed its usual pace, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside. Elena remained where she was, her hands moving again, folding, aligning, resetting the small details that kept everything in order, and within seconds, her presence faded completely back into the background. Just another waitress in a room designed to make people like her disappear, but the room itself felt different, not to the guests, not to the staff, but to the space between things, to the quiet alignment of objects and movement and intention, as if something had been corrected at a level no one could name. Elena picked up the last napkin and placed it down with perfect precision, then stepped back, her eyes calm, her breathing steady, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to stand still, not in rest, but in completion, because some actions did not need to be remembered to matter, they only needed to be done, and once they were, they belonged to nothing and no one, disappearing as quietly as they had begun. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm by the time Jonathan Hale stepped onto the sidewalk, the city wrapping around him in noise and motion, headlights stretching across wet pavement, footsteps echoing in uneven patterns. But his pace slowed for the first time that evening. Not because of the weather, not because of the hour, but because something inside the last 30 minutes refused to dissolve into the ordinary. He paused beneath the awning, just beyond the restaurant doors, his reflection faint in the glass behind him. And for a moment, he did not move, his mind tracing back through details that did not behave like normal memory. There were no clear events, no direct actions, only shifts, subtle, precise, deliberate, and yet the outcome had been absolute. Inside, Elena Vance carried a tray toward table 12, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, the same quiet efficiency that had defined her all evening. And to anyone watching, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a waitress finishing her shift in a room that demanded invisibility from those who served within it. She set down 2 glasses of water, the condensation catching the soft light, then stepped back, her eyes scanning the room once more, not searching, not expecting, simply confirming what she already knew, that the space had returned to its natural balance. One of the remaining guests laughed too loudly near the bar. Another checked his phone. A couple near the window leaned closer together, their conversation uninterrupted, untouched, and that was the final proof, because whatever had nearly happened had left no residue, no trace, nothing that could be named or questioned. Elena turned toward the service corridor, her steps quiet, her hands steady, and as she pushed through the door into the narrower space behind the dining room, the air shifted, cooler, more direct, stripped of the curated elegance of the front, and for the first time, she allowed her shoulders to relax by a fraction, not enough to be seen, but enough to release the tension that had never shown on her face. A coworker passed her with a tired smile, unaware, asking something about closing duties, and Elena answered simply, her voice calm, her tone unremarkable, blending back into the routine that defined this place more than any single moment ever could. Outside, Hale finally stepped away from the awning, the rain touching his coat in a fine, steady pattern, and he walked without urgency, his mind still occupied, not by fear, not by confusion, but by a realization that settled slowly, firmly, that control, real control, did not always come from position or authority. It came from perception, from timing, from the ability to see what others dismissed. He reached the curb, a black car already waiting, its presence as precise as everything else in his life. And as the door opened, he paused once more, just for a second, looking back through the glass, toward the restaurant, toward the warm light, toward the place where something had shifted without ever revealing itself. Inside, Elena removed the locket from beneath her collar for just a moment, her fingers brushing its surface, not as a habit, but as a quiet acknowledgement, a connection to something that did not belong to this place. Then she let it fall back against her skin, hidden again, exactly where it needed to be. Hale entered the car without another word, the door closing with a soft, final sound, and as the vehicle pulled away into the rain, the distance grew quickly, the moment already dissolving into the city behind him. Elena returned to the dining room seconds later, her presence once again seamless, her movements precise, her expression unchanged, and if anyone had looked at her then, they would have seen nothing more than a waitress finishing her shift, unaware that the most important thing she had done that night would never be written, never be spoken, and never need to be remembered to matter. The night moved forward without hesitation, the restaurant continuing its quiet performance as if nothing had ever brushed against its edges, and Elena Vance followed the rhythm until it no longer required thought, until each step, each motion, each glance returned to something automatic, something practiced, something safe. Plates were cleared, glasses replaced, chairs adjusted by fractions of an inch, and the staff around her settled into the final stretch of the evening, voices softer now, movements slower, the invisible signal that closing time was approaching beginning to take hold. Elena moved through it all with the same calm precision, but there was a stillness beneath her actions now. Not tension, not fatigue, but completion, the kind that did not demand recognition, only quiet acknowledgement. Near the window, the rain had softened, no longer a steady curtain, but a gentle trace against the glass. The city lights beyond sharpening again, their reflections stretching across the polished floor, and for a moment, the room felt suspended between what had happened and what would come next, balanced in a way no one could name. A manager passed by, checking tables, nodding with quiet approval, unaware that anything beyond service and timing had been measured that night, and Elena returned the nod without pause, her role unchanged, her presence still exactly what it needed to be, at the far end of the room. The last of the late guests finished their meals, conversations. Winding down, coats gathered, the soft choreography of departure beginning, and one by one, the tables emptied, leaving behind only the faint impressions of what had been, glasses with the last trace of condensation, plates cleared but not yet removed, chairs slightly turned. As if the room itself remembered the people who had occupied it moments before. Elena paused at table 7, the one where Jonathan Hale had sat, her fingers resting lightly on the back of the chair across from where he had been, the empty seat that had remained untouched all evening. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to notice it, not as a symbol, not as a question, but as a detail, one more piece of the quiet structure that had held the night together. She straightened the chair, aligning it perfectly with the table, her movements slow, deliberate, and then stepped back, her eyes scanning the space once more, confirming what she already understood, that everything was in its place, that nothing remained out of balance. In the service corridor, the sounds of closing grew clearer, dishes being stacked, soft voices exchanging final tasks, the steady rhythm of a shift ending. And Elena moved toward it without hesitation, blending back into the flow of work that required no memory of what had come before. Outside, the city carried on, unaware, unchanged, its noise and motion swallowing the details of every moment that passed within it. And somewhere within that motion, Jonathan Hale's car moved through the streets, carrying with it a realization that would not fade as easily as the night itself. Back inside, Elena reached the last station and folded a final cloth, placing it down with the same careful precision she had shown all evening, her hands steady, her expression calm. And as she stepped away, there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to correct, only the quiet certainty that what needed to happen had already happened. The lights dimmed slightly as the final guests left, the room settling into its closing state, and Elena stood for a moment at the edge of it all, not as a figure of importance, not as someone to be noticed, but as part of the structure itself, something that existed to maintain balance and then disappear. She turned, without looking back, and walked toward the exit reserved for staff, her steps light, her presence already fading into the ordinary. And by the time the door closed softly behind her, the night had fully returned to what it had always appeared to be, leaving no trace of the moment when everything had quietly, completely changed. The street outside carried a different kind of silence, not the curated quiet of polished wood and soft lighting, but the honest stillness that followed rain, where every sound traveled a little farther and every movement felt more defined. And Elena Vance stepped into it without hesitation, the door behind her closing with a gentle finality that marked the end of one world and the return to another. She adjusted her coat with a small, practiced motion, her fingers briefly brushing the locket beneath the fabric, confirming its place without needing to see it. Then she began to walk, her pace steady, unhurried, blending into the late evening flow of the city as if she had always belonged there. The sidewalk reflected the glow of street lights and long, wavering lines. Cars passed in measured intervals, and somewhere in the distance a siren rose and faded without urgency. All of it ordinary, all of it exactly as it should be. And yet for Elena, the night had already resolved itself, the variables closed, the outcome sealed, nothing left to anticipate. Several blocks away, Jonathan Hale sat in the back of his car, the city moving past him in fragments of light and shadow, his reflection faint against the window, and for the first time in years he was not reviewing numbers, not calculating outcomes, not preparing for the next decision. He was thinking about something he could not quantify, something that had no report, no data, no measurable impact, and yet had shifted his understanding in a way no negotiation ever had. He replayed the moment again, not as an event, but as an absence, the way nothing had happened when something clearly should have, the way control had changed direction without force. And the more he considered it, the clearer it became that power did not always belong to the person everyone could see. Sometimes it belonged to the one no one noticed at all. Elena reached the corner and paused briefly at the crosswalk, the signal above counting down in quiet red numbers. And she stood there among strangers, just another figure waiting for the light to change. Her expression calm, her posture relaxed, indistinguishable from anyone else. And that was the truth of it, because what she carried did not need to be visible to exist. The light shifted, the signal turned, and she crossed with the others, her steps measured, her gaze forward, leaving behind the restaurant, the moment, the man who would remember, and everything that had nearly unfolded but never did. Hale's car slowed at an intersection, the city stretching ahead in endless lines of possibility, and he leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a brief second, not in fatigue, but in clarity, because something had been revealed to him without explanation, something simple and exact, that influence without noise, control without display, and strength without recognition were not weaknesses. They were the highest forms of power. Elena continued down the street until the restaurant was no longer visible, until the light behind her faded into the rest of the city. And with each step, the identity she carried inside those walls dissolved completely, leaving only what remained when no one was watching, a quiet presence, a steady mind, a life that did not require acknowledgement to have meaning. She turned onto a quieter block, the noise of traffic softening, the air cooler, and for a moment, she stopped, just long enough to look up at the sky where the clouds had begun to break, revealing a faint line of clear darkness beyond them. Then she exhaled slowly and continued on, her figure disappearing into the night without resistance. And somewhere, carried not in words but in understanding, a truth settled into place, quiet and permanent, that the loudest power is often the least important, and the ones who change everything rarely need to say a single word.